In 1914, millions of young men volunteered or were conscripted into what they believed would be a short war. They were clerks, factory workers, farmers, students. Most were in their late teens or early 20s. Few understood the scale of what was coming. The war that began in the summer of 1914 would become known as World War I. It introduced industrialized killing on a scale the world had never seen. By the time it ended in 1918, an entire generation had been marked by trench warfare, artillery bombardment, poison gas, and loss. Many believed it was the war to end all wars. They were wrong. 21 years later, many of the same men would put on uniforms again. The First World War was defined by stalemate and attrition. Along the Western Front, soldiers lived in trenches that stretched for hundreds of miles. Conditions were wet, unsanitary, and psychologically exhausting. Rats and disease were common. Artillery fire was constant. Major battles such as the Battle of the Somme resulted in hundreds of thousands of casualties for minimal territorial gain. For many soldiers, survival depended less on strategy and more on endurance. By 1918, those who remained were no longer the optimistic young men who had marched off in 1914. They had witnessed industrialized slaughter. They had lost friends, brothers, and commanders. When the armistice was signed in November 1918, relief was widespread. But relief did not erase what they had experienced. Many returned home carrying physical wounds. Others carried what was then called shell shock, a condition not fully understood at the time. The war ended. The memory did not. The peace settlement that followed, including the Treaty of Versailles, reshaped Europe politically and economically. In several countries, veterans struggled to reintegrate into civilian life. Economies were unstable. Political systems were fragile. In the 1920s and 1930s, economic depression and rising nationalism altered the global balance of power. Some veterans remained in military service. Others joined reserve units. Many simply tried to rebuild their lives. They married. They started families. They found work where they could. By the late 1930s, the men who had fought in 1914 were no longer young. Many were now in their late 30s or early 40s. When war returned to Europe in 1939, they faced a decision they thought they would never confront again. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The conflict that followed became known as World War II. Unlike the trench-dominated warfare of 1914 to 1918, this war was faster, more mechanized, and more expansive. Tanks replaced cavalry. Aircraft dominated the sky. Civilian populations became direct targets. Many veterans of the First War returned to service, often as non-commissioned officers or senior enlisted men. Their age and experience placed them in leadership roles. Some fought in campaigns across North Africa. Others endured the Eastern Front, including battles such as the Battle of Stalingrad. On the Western Front, the Allied invasion of Normandy, known as D-Day, marked another massive confrontation in Europe. For those who had served in both wars, the contrast was stark. In 1916, survival meant enduring artillery barrages in muddy trenches. In 1944, survival meant navigating tank assaults, aerial bombardment, and highly mobile combat. The weapons had evolved. The destruction had intensified. But the human experience of fear, fatigue, and uncertainty remained the same. Several prominent figures experienced both wars directly. Adolf Hitler served as a soldier during the First World War. 2 decades later, he led Germany during the Second. Charles de Gaulle fought in the First World War and later became the leader of Free French forces during the Second. Winston Churchill had military experience before and during the First World War and served as Prime Minister throughout much of the Second. They are remembered because history recorded their names. But beyond them were hundreds of thousands of ordinary soldiers whose stories were never formally documented. Men who fought in 1916 and again in 1940. Men who survived once and were asked to endure it again. To fight one global war in a lifetime is extraordinary. To fight two is historically rare. For those who experienced both conflicts, the cumulative impact was profound. They had seen the collapse of empires. They had witnessed technological transformation in warfare. They had buried friends in two different uniforms. By 1945, those who survived both wars were no longer young. They had lived through 3 decades defined by instability and violence. Many rarely spoke about what they had seen. Between 1914 and 1945, one generation stood at the center of 2 global conflicts. They entered the first war as young men. They entered the second as veterans. History often measures wars by strategy, territory, and political outcomes. But for these soldiers, history was measured in years of service, lost friends, and survival. They fought once, and then they fought again.